Okay, to emphasize the wabi-sabi sort of rustic aesthetic quality of the work of today's reading, I thought I would film today's video in front of this memorial tombstone for a famous samurai in the Muromachi period, I think. I'll put the information about the samurai in the link. Today's reading is Matsuo Bashō's Nozarashi Kikō, translated into English by David Landis Barnhill as Journal of Bleached Bones in a Field. Okay, it's a travel journal written between 1684 and 1685 as by Matsuo芭蕉as he traveled around Japan with his friend. Okay, I have some links to the English translation to several versions of the original and so forth in the study guide. You can review that, and also before you read this work and watch this video and read the study guide, review my notes on Waka Renga and Haikai Renga and my video commentary that I posted the other day before you do that, so you refamiliarize yourself with these important terms like Waka Renga, Haikai Renga. I'll go over them briefly again here, but watch that video once more. Okay, so let's start with the key figures, terms, genres. Matsuo芭蕉, of course, is the great poet of the great Haikai poet of the Edo period, most famous poet of the Edo period, which begins 1603, ends in 1867. During his lifetime, he was best known for his works in the collaborative Haikai Renga form, but today he's remembered as the master of the single stanza hokku, or what is today called haiku. Remember that haiku is a word that was coined in the modern period, in the Meiji period, and its original word was hokku, and the hokku just simply meant the first ku stanza in a renga sequence, right? But with time those slowly became independent verses in their own right, and today he's remembered as a hokku poet, but we must always think of him in this context of haikai, right? Haikai renga. Many of his poems are reproduced on monuments, traditional sites set in Japan. Okay, all right. The title of this work is Nozarashi Kiko. It's his first travel account. So he wrote several works of this genre. The genre is called the Kikōbun, right? The work begins with an inauspicious hokku. Usually, when you go on a journey and you keep a travel log and write poems and so forth, you start with an auspicious hokku. But in this case, he starts with a very inauspicious hokku, right? And it's Nozarashi yo kokoro ni kaze no shimu mi kana. That's how it starts. In a mix of prose and poetry, he describes his travels that he made between 1684 and 1685 with his companion Chiri. Okay, so Chiri is his friend who accompanies him on this journey. And the main purpose of the journey is, or at least ostensibly it is, to visit the gravestone of his recently deceased mother. I think his mother died a year before, and he's going to see her gravestone in his hometown of Iga, right, which is in present-day Mie Prefecture. Okay, so keep in mind a lot of these chime, or place names that appear, are in the old kuni, the old province system, so convert them in your head to the modern prefecture system as you read. Departing from Edo, the two men they started by heading toward Ise, along the Tokaido, the famous highway, right, that everybody makes when they make the pilgrimage to Ise and so forth. After passing through his hometown in Iga, they continue on to Yamato province, Yamato no Kuni, right, which is modern-day Nara, and at this point it's early spring. They visit the town of Ogaki in Mino Prefecture. They stop by Nagoya for a bit and its vicinity, composing a string of verses in the winter. They spend the New Year at Iga and so forth. Okay, I have a bunch of the place names, and they end up at the same point where they started, namely Edo, right? So they start their journey in Edo. They go all around Japan for a year and a half or so, or almost a year. No, not a year and a half. A year, a bit less than a year, and then they return to Edo in the end. Okay, so this is only a rough outline. Fill in the details as you read. And I have a question that specifically asks you to map out the places of their journey. Okay, the next term on the key terms is Haikai Renga. Haikai Renga is non-standard renga, or linked verse, right? Renga simply means linked verse. Haikai Renga means non-standard linked verse. It's derived from previous Renga. It took on seriousness with the evolution of the Teimon, the Danrinfu, and the Shofu styles. Okay, I mentioned all this in the notes on Haikai video that I made, so you can watch that again. Haikai embraced parody, vulgar elements, okay, in contrast to previous Renga. So previous Renga would only use sort of standard classical diction. Haikai, by contrast, embraced parody, vulgar elements, and so forth. Its rough Haikai spirit, or hai, combined disparate elements and fused classical forms with everyday contemporary reality. Okay, the next term on the list is haibun. Okay, so this work we're reading today is an example of haibun. Haibun simply means haikai writings, literary genre that combines diaristic prose and haikai poetry. Okay, the term is first used by Bashō in 1690. Okay, so the term wasn't even in existence when he wrote this work, but it can still be used to applied to this work, I think. The next term on your list is haikai travel writings, haikai kikōbun. Okay, so Bashō's haikai kikōbun have their roots in older Japanese literary genres such as the poetic diary, the utaniki, and nikki bungaku. Nikki bungaku, of course, is a term that came up that appeared much later in the modern period and was retroactively applied to all of these uta-nikki genres of the classical period. Okay, and these earlier poetic diary genres emerged and flourished during the Heian period. You have the dates there. The first poetic diary is by the famed poet Kino Tsurayuki, called Tosa Nikki, published in the mid-Heian period, right, or written in 935 approximately. And this work, Tosa Nikki, records in a mix of vernacular prose and 57 waka poems his journey from Tosa in Shikoku to Kyoto through the perspective of a female character. Okay, other examples of utaniki include Kagero Nikki of the Heian period, 974, Murasaki Shikibu Nikki, and so forth. Okay, Saigyo. Okay, Saigyo is alluded to in this work by Matsuo芭蕉on several occasions, so I thought I'd include an introduction to him here. Saigyo is a late Heian poet, major poet, and Buddhist priest of the late Heian period. His life and works became the subject of numerous no plays, jōruri puppet dramas, legends, and setsuwa anecdotes. Okay, he abandoned his military career and worldly concerns to travel throughout Japan, write poetry, and reflect on the fallen state of late Heian civilization. His works included the anthology Sankashu, Poems of a Mountain Home, late 12th century, and Mimosu Sogawa, Utaawase. Okay, that's a collection of poetry contests at Mimosusu River. Many of his poems are included in the imperial anthology Shinkokinshu, the Shinkokin Wakashu, right? Which is the third or fourth, I can't remember the number, a major imperial poetry waka anthology compiled in 1206. Saigyo's influence can be found in later poets, particularly Matsuo芭蕉, as we see here. And Matsuo Bashō's narrators they often fancy themselves as a kind of modern-day Saigyo. Okay, so in this work we see Matsuo Bashō's narrator poet comparing himself to Saigyo on various occasions. Okay, the next and final term here is Karo Tosen. Karo Tosen, which means, it's written with the kanji for a hot furnace in summer and a cooling fan, sen, in winter. Okay, so it means literally a hot furnace in summer and a cooling fan in winter. In short, useless things. So Bashō used this phrase to describe his view that haikai poetry serves no practical use, but is nonetheless of paramount importance. Okay, the idea relates to the Taoist ideas of muyo no yo, which means usefulness of being useless, muyo no yo, and the other famous Taoist idea of mui, or wu wei, doing nothing or non-action. Okay, so I have another video about Karo Tosen. You can click on the link to watch that again. But just keep in the back of your mind, whenever you read Matsuo芭蕉, he's always writing within the context of classical Chinese poetry, specifically the sort of literate poetry of the Hermetic tradition, recluse poetry, the kind of poetry that is very influenced by Taoism, basically. So he always has Zhuangzi and other Taoist ideas and notions and writers and so forth, and works in the back of his mind as he's writing these works. Okay, enough about the introductory key terms. Let's jump now into the questions. I think I have, let me see, I have 18 questions in all. Let's go through these as quickly as possible. Number 1, consider the word Nozarashi, literally exposed in a field, something exposed to the elements, bleached bones, skeletons in the field. Why does Bashō choose to include this inauspicious word in the work's title and opening hokku? Okay, it's a very inauspicious word, right? Usually when you go on a journey, you start with an auspicious word, but he does the opposite here. What does this image evoke? What is its significance of What is the significance of starting a journey with the image of bleached bones? How does the image relate to his mother's recent death? Okay, remember his mother died a year ago, and he's going to visit her gravestone. And there's this sort of running theme throughout the work of death. Is this work a meditation on death, a preparation for his own death? Okay, I think he's expecting to die on this journey too, and at one point he expresses surprise at his not having died yet. Right? Explain. Okay, that's question number 1. Number 2, consider the work in relation to the classical Japanese literary genre of the Kikō, which I mentioned above, introduced above. Travel diary literature, which starts with Tosaniki in the early or mid Heian period, 905 I think I said. 935, sorry, by Kino Tsurayuki. Kino Tsurayuki, of course, is the major poet in the Kokinshu as well, and the author of the famous preface to the Kokinshu. Alright, so how does this work relate to this genre that begins over 7 centuries before Bashō's writing this? Okay, how does his work conform to these earlier genres? How does it depart from them? Explain. This is probably the most difficult question on the study guide this time, because it requires you to look into these previous examples of the genre, and I understand that you are all undergrads and you won't have this background knowledge, the adequate background knowledge to answer this question, so just answer to the best of your ability there. Number 3, note how Bashō's narrator poet, okay, we always wanted to distinguish between Bashō himself, the writer, and this sort of literary persona that he creates in his work. So I make a sort of somewhat forced distinction between Bashō himself and his narrator poet whenever I talk about these. But keep that in mind when you read my study guide questions and when you write your essays on this work, if you choose to write on this work. Note how Bashō's narrator poet, even as he assumes the literary persona of an eternally homeless, lonesome, wandering poet-hermit in keeping with the Chinese literati tradition, also seems to be exceedingly popular. Okay, wherever he goes, he is greeted by friends and admirers. Explain this apparent contradiction. Make a list of all the friends, admirers, hosts, and priests whom he meets along his during his journey. Give brief descriptions of each character and their relationship to him and to the story. What can be discerned about them from their names and their titles? For example, Bokuin. All we know about this guy is his name is Bokuin, but that name should tell you something about what he does. He's probably not a peasant or a farmer if his name is Bokuin, right? The abbot of Engakuji, who recently died, his friend Toyo, and so forth. Okay, so this is basically a question about the other characters that he meets along the way. Okay, what they represent, what they reveal about his own character, about this paradox or contradiction, apparent contradiction between the persona that he's performing, sort of, and who Matsuo芭蕉really is in the Edo period as a sort of haikai celebrity. Okay, number 4. Chart the course of Bashō's journey, which starts and ends in Edo. Make a list of all the sites, the regions, the place names, the chime, that he visits. Note the seasonal transitions. Okay, I started to do this at the beginning, right? I made a list of some of the places he visits, flesh that out, and make a more detailed itinerary of his travels. Okay, note the seasonal transitions. Okay, so wherever he goes, he gives you clues as to what season it is at that moment, right? How do you know what season it is? Does he use seasonal words? If so, what seasonal words or season words, Kikō, does he use? Okay, number 5. Describe his companion Naemuri Chiri. Okay, Chiri is how he's referred to in the work. He was a poet of the same time period as Bashō, obviously, from Yamato no Kuni, present-day Nara prefecture. Why does Bashō usually have a companion with him on his travels? So you read his other Kikōbun works, and he rarely, if ever, travels alone. He's always got a companion with him. Why does he always have a companion with him? Is this a literary convention inherited from earlier travel literature? Is it related to the fact that renga, linked verse, and haikai renga, non-standard linked verse, are collaborative poetic forms? Are the two men always together while traveling, or do they split up at certain points? How many hokku does Chiri contribute? Okay, so notice that Chiri writes his own hokku, usually in response to one being put forth by Matsuo芭蕉, and never sort of overshadowing him or showing him up, right? They're always kind of subdued and humble. How do his hokku stand in relation to Bashō's hokku? Okay. Number 6. Discuss the narrator poet's famous encounter with the child he finds abandoned at the side of the road. Okay, so there's this episode where he finds a child who's probably about to die of starvation, right? Just under 2 years old, finds him at the side of the road. How does he respond? What sort of worldview informs or underpins his response, right? So he responds in a certain way. Is this response a Buddhist, informed by a sort of Buddhist worldview? Explain. What would you do in a similar circumstance? Okay. Number 7. Make a list of all the explicit classical literary allusions that appear in the text, both in the prose passages and the poems. Okay, this is kind of easy to do because in the English translation at least, and in the Japanese, in the Zenshu that I mentioned at the beginning of the study guide, there are footnotes, right, and they tell you each time something is being alluded to. So some of the major examples of allusions, literary allusions that appear here are the poet monk Saigyo, of course, Saigyo, who I mentioned in the introduction. The legend of Urashima Taro appears here. Various Tang Dynasty Chinese poets, and a few of their poems, I think. Why does the narrator poet describe the world of poetry as a world that one flees to and takes refuge in? Okay, explain his view of poetry as a kind of liminal space between an ideal world and reality, between past, which is an idealized past of the classical literary tradition, and a kind of degraded or lowered or common or vulgar present, right? High and low, high culture and low culture. So Matsuo芭蕉tends to view the realm of poetry, which is extra-temporal. It kind of exists outside of time. He views poetry as this kind of extra-temporal world that fuses these binaries, right, of the ideal and reality, past and present, high and low, and so forth. Okay. Answer that question to the best of your ability in the context of this work. Number 8. What haikai words, or haigon in Japanese is the word, meaning unorthodox diction, can you find in the poems here? Okay, one example, I'll give you a hint, zammu. Zammu is a very Chinese word, right? It's pronounced in onyomi, 2 Chinese characters lined up, meaning a sort of remnant dream, or a dream that's kind of left over even after you wake up, I think is what it means. It might appear in the Zhuangzi, the Taoist text, right? That's a word that you do not find in classical renga or in classical waka. In, for example, the major imperial anthologies of the Heian period, you would not find the word zammu. What is the effect of these words? So find the other words that are like this, these other haigong. What is the effect on the poem? Are they what traditional or standard poetic words can you find in the poems too? That's sort of another question, but it's still part of this question. So find the haigon and find the standard words in these poems. For example, hotodogise, of course, is a standard word that appears all throughout the Heian poetic anthologies. Are these standard words Kikō, season words? Explain. Number 9. Make a list of all instances of mitate. Okay, mitate is a very important word in the context of Edo art, Edo literature, Edo ukiyo-e, and so forth. Remember this word, underline it, write it down. It means double vision illusions, analogical figuration, parodic images, it's sometimes translated. Literally, it just means seen by comparison, okay, that appear in this work. Alright, mitate. And a good way to explain this word might be, my 2 kids are really into Super Mario Brothers at the moment, right? So the characters Mario, Luigi, Princess, and so forth, they're obsessed with it, they're always thinking about it. So whenever I take my 2 kids on a walk through the park, we play Mario Gokko, right? Or pretend Mario Brothers. And they fancy themselves as Mario, for example. My daughter thinks she's Princess, and whatever they see around them, they see in terms of the game Mario Brothers, right? So they'll find a rock and they'll say that's the mushroom. They'll find a yellow posting on the tree and they'll say that's the star that appears in Mario Brothers, right? That's basically what mitate is, right? It's to see the world through some previous story or previous text or previous poem or so forth, right? And this is the sort of characteristic feature, defining feature of Edo aesthetics, right? Everything, contemporary reality is filtered or mediated through these previous texts. And Matsuo芭蕉is the sort of example par excellence of this technique. Okay, and 2 examples of this technique that we see here. Whenever the narrator poet compares himself to the late Heian monk poet Saigyo, right? So he compares himself to Saigyo on several occasions in this work. He sees himself as kind of a modern-day Saigyo. Of course, not as great as the great poet Saigyo, a sort of lesser version of him, and he's humble about it. But he sees himself through this classical tradition and through the lens of Saigyo. Another example is when he likens the mountains that he sees in the heart of the Yoshino province, right, the Yoshino Kuni. He visits Yoshino Kuni and he sees the mountains back there, and he immediately likens them to Mount Lushan, right, of central China, which was often depicted in Tang era poetry, Tang dynasty poetry, right? So again, he's looking at natural phenomenon in his own world, but he's filtering them through the lens of classical China in this case, right? So how does Bashō seek to unify reality and ideal, past and present, tradition and contemporary reality, high culture and low culture, and so forth, through his writings, right? So he views haikai as kind of this field in which all of these opposites are unified. Number 10. Identify and describe the Taoist elements, Taoist images, Taoist references that appear in the work. For example, the thatched hut recluse, I think, has sort of Taoist overtones, right? Zhuangzi, right? One of the foundational figures of Taoism is Zhuangzi, who wrote the famous parable of the butterfly in his famous work called the Zhuangzi, right? Matsuo Bashō's narrator refers to that in a few occasions in this work, and there are some other Taoist references as well. Identify them and explain them. Okay, number 11 is more of a point than a question. The 4th month, or the Uzuki, in the old lunar calendar corresponds to what month in today's calendar, the Gregorian calendar? Okay, so 4th month Uzuki in the original says, and the translator translates that as the 4th month, right? Review the old lunar calendar, and I have a list here, right? The first month, remember that the old Japanese lunar year begins in what is today our early February or mid-February, somewhere in between early February and mid-February, right? So the first month is early February, or mid-February in our calendar. First month is called Mutsuki. Second month is called Kisaragi. Third month is called Yayoi, and I have the kanji there on your study guide. Fourth month is called Uzuki. Fifth month is called Satsuki. Sixth month is called Minatsuki. Seventh month is Fuzuki or Fumizuki. Eighth month is Hazuki. Ninth month is Nagatsuki. 10th month is Kannazuki, right, the godless month, the god month with no gods, literally. The 11th month is Shimozuki, and the last month is Shiwasa. Okay, so keep in mind, make the conversion whenever the months appear in the work. All right, so you're not accidentally reading it according to the Gregorian calendar. Number 12. In what state does he find his family and home upon returning to Iga, his hometown? Remember, Iga is his hometown. He returns to visit his mother's gravestone. And what state does he find everything in? Okay, this is in modern-day Mie Prefecture. Describe the state of his dead mother's room. Describe the condition of his brothers and the sisters. Note how once again he describes his experiences through mitate, which I just explained, the Mario Brothers stuff. Analogical figuration, seen by comparison. Okay, so note how he describes his experience through mitate, this time referring to the legend of Urashima Taro. Why Urashima Taro? If you're not familiar with the Urashima Taro, review this famous story, which appears in a lot of modern Japanese literary works as well, right? What philosophical or religious point is he trying to emphasize here, right, by alluding to this story of Urashima Taro, who goes into the ocean world and comes back, right, and everything is changed. Number 13. 13. Discuss the role and the function of the hokku poems in this work, right? There are many hokku, many poems. Don't call them haikai, call them hokku. How many of the hokku are by Bashō? How do they relate to the overall story and to each episode? Are they occasional poems? Occasional poems, underline that word, it's sort of a literary term. Written to commemorate certain occasions. Explain their content and their social contexts, right? So each of these poems emerge out of a certain social context or a setting, right? What is the setting behind them? Explain. Okay, number 14. The site of a massive, presumably 1,000-year-old pine in Yamato province prompts some philosophical remarks and a poem from the narrator poet. Explain this response and this poem, the poem that he writes. Why does he allude to Zhuangzi's idea that pines live long because they are useless, muyo? How does this relate to Bashō's notion of muyo no yo, which is originally a Taoist notion, of course, which means usefulness, the usefulness of being useless, and to Bashō's idea of the karo tosen, which I introduced in the literary terms at the beginning of the study guide, in which I have a video about, you can watch, right? So it's a famous story when one of Bashō's disciples asked, what is haikai to you? What is bungaku? What does literature, art mean to you? He said it is karo tosen, right? It is useless, right? Useless, and because it is useless, it is therefore more important than anything else, was his point. Okay. Number 15. How many more questions? Well, 3 more to go. Identify the Chinese landscape painting-like scenes that appear in this work. Do these scenic depictions include any tenkei jinbutsu? Okay. This is a art world term that you see a lot in discussions of Chinese and Japanese paintings. Tenkei jinbutsu, and what does it mean? It means the little tiny background human figures or animal figures that are added as secondary elements to a landscape painting. Okay, so in some of these depictions that Bashō gives, you kind of get the sense that he's thinking of these sort of literati, Chinese and Japanese paintings, as he's composing the prose, right? And occasionally you have little tiny humans in the background to his depictions of nature and landscapes. Explain. Okay, number 16. Find the passages that relate to Buddhism. What Buddhist associations or messages can you discern? And keep in mind that sometimes it's hard to distinguish between the Taoist elements and the Buddhist elements, and that's mainly because Buddhism, according to some theories, came out of Taoism, right? Buddhism is kind of born from Taoism, which precedes it. So Taoist thought comes first, has these certain ideas, and then Buddhism was possibly influenced by a lot of those ideas. Okay, but there are specifically or explicitly Buddhist references and images and so forth in this work. Find them and explain them. Number 17. Find the passages that relate to Shinto. Okay, so the previous question was about Buddhism. This one's about Shinto, Japan's ancient, mostly native religion. How does he react to the wabi-sabi, withered ruins, when he visits the great Atsuta Jingu near Nagoya? Okay, so he goes to this famous Shinto shrine called Atsuta Jingu, which is sort of near my house. You can still visit it today, and it's not in good shape. It's withered, it's ruined. However, he's not disappointed by this. He's sort of moved by this wabi-sabi aesthetic rusticity that pervades the scene, right? And he finds it even more moving than if it had been well kept, right? I shouldn't give away the answer, but yes, review that passage, explain his response to the shrine and the scene, and how it relates to his overall general poetic sensibility. And finally, now the last question. Discuss the hokku that appears in the second half of the work, Shimosenu tabine no Shimosenu tabine no hate yo aki no kure. Shimosenu tabine no hate yo aki no kure. Okay, so it's the first part has only 4 syllables, but yes, that hokku that appears toward the end of the work. Why does he say that he is not dead yet? Shimosenu means I am not dead yet, right? Was he expecting to die on this trip? So again, the image of death appears, right? Which connects it with the, which relates to the original hokku and the title of the work, of course, and the idea and motifs and images of death run throughout this work, right? Was he expecting to die here on this trip? Is he surprised to find that he has survived this long? Explain. Okay. It's a fairly short work, only I think 9 or 10 pages in the English translation, and much shorter in the Japanese, but it's extremely, extremely dense. And I've included the annotations and the footnotes provided by the translator Barnhill. So make sure you read the footnotes and the annotations as you read the work. And okay, I have a list 3 further reading in English sources that I posted there. 2 by Haro Shirane, Traces of Dreams, Landscape, Cultural Memory in the Poetry of Bashō, 1998, and Shirane Sensei's Early Modern Japanese Literature and Anthology, which is published in 2002. Early modern period, of course, is basically the Edo period, and also Barnhill's translation that I mentioned in the beginning that we're using. And then I have a map of Japan in the Edo period. It's actually major Sengoku period feudal domains between 1564 and 1573. So just before the Edo period. However, the kuni, the province names are basically the same. So when you see Yamato or when you see Mino or any of these provinces referred to in the work, glance at this map to find out where exactly Bashō is at that certain moment. Okay, the map itself was made in 1855. And at the very end of the study guide I have the original Japanese text, which you can see is much shorter than the English translation. I think this is the full. Yes, I think it is. Okay, that is all for now. If you have any questions about this very dense, difficult, but very rewarding work, send me an email. That is all for now. Bye-bye.